But before she goes, she's introducing him to the glacier. See how he's working away. Good job, Jordan. Still harder. There you go. Love that sound. Demon's gonna have to try. Yeah.
Jordan River Anderson from Norway House Cree Nation is one of those children. He was born with complex medical needs. For the first 2 years of his life, he stayed in hospital not far from here in Winnipeg Children's Hospital. But after his second birthday, he should have gone home. All the services were ready for him to go home. But what did the government of Canada say? Oh, well, it's really good that Jordan can go home. But we're not sure we have authorities to pay for his at-home care. The province of Manitoba said, Jordan is a federal responsibility. He's a status Indian child on reserve. We don't want to set the precedent of picking up a federal cost. There's no question about it. If Jordan was non-Aboriginal, he would have gone home that day. But as it was, the government officials thought it was okay for that little boy to stay in the hospital while they argued over who should pay. In making that decision in the first instance, they allowed themselves to cross over that bridge of saying that racial discrimination against a child, because no other child would have been denied the opportunity to go home. No other child. That by crossing that river and saying that because he's First Nations, he can stay in hospital while we figure out who is going to pay from our respective surplus budgets. They then entered into the realm of the immoral. And not just days passed on Jordan's calendars, but days turned into weeks and weeks into years. And this little boy would have other little kids come into his hospital room, and they would all get better, and they would go home. And he was better, and he wasn't going home. The other boys would talk to him about what it is to put both feet into a mud puddle and get all the water spraying upwards, or what it is to put your arms around a big dog, or to hear the drums in your cultural ceremony. And he had done none of that. He was trapped in the hospital. His family, his community, the doctors and the nurses were all pleading with the governments to do the right thing. Let this little boy go home. But the governments didn't listen. They were afraid of setting a precedent of picking up somebody else's cost. And so it was that just after Jordan's 5th birthday, he lost hope and he dies in Winnipeg General Hospital, never having spent a day in a family home. At the time when Jordan passed, we did a study of only 12 of the 108 First Nations communities running First Nations agencies in this country, and we found 400 other children in the same situation that Jordan was in, being told, no, you have to wait while we figure out who should pay. Jordan's principle is simple. It applies when a government service is available to all other children. So basically, if you are non-Aboriginal, you get the service. That's when it applies. And one of these crazy payment disputes crops up. Whoever gets contacted first, provincial, territorial, or the federal government, pays for the bill, and they argue as much about it as they'd like after. It's a very simple principle. It passed unanimously in the House of Commons in 2007, but it has never been implemented by any provincial government or properly by the federal government. The federal government has sought about to do even something more disgraceful, and that is to narrow this little boy's legacy to say, no, Jordan's principle does not apply to all government services, only services for children with complex medical needs.
Well, what we've seen immediately after that was the government trying to narrow Jordan's principle to only apply to children with disabilities, with complex medical needs and multiple service providers. Jordan's principle applies to all government services. And what we also saw is that First Nations were being left out of the conversations about how best to implement Jordan's principle. They became conversations really between government officials at the federal and provincial level. So sadly, I was hearing reports by family members, healthcare workers, social workers, community members across the country saying, I have a child who's in a Jordan's principle situation, who's being denied services they would otherwise receive because they're a First Nations child. And yet the government's official statements are that there's been no Jordan's principle cases since 2008. Now that would come as a huge surprise to Maurina Beadle. Maurina Beadle is a very traditional, proud Mi'kmaq woman from Pictou Landing First Nation in Nova Scotia. And she is the proud mother of 2 young men, Jonathan, her older son, and Jeremy, Now, if she was here, she'd want you all to know that Jeremy is really loves the powwow drum. He just comes alive with music and art and those types of wonderful gifts. What's also true is that he's a child who is born with cerebral palsy, born with a severe form of autism, and that he requires significant personal care. And Maurina provided that, despite the lower level of services that we were talking about earlier. Until Jeremy's 15 years of age, when Maurina tragically suffers a double stroke. So severe that she cannot walk or hold a water glass. Her first thought is not for herself at all. It's who's going to look after Jeremy, because Jonathan has a job and he cares for the family and he does what he can to help Jeremy, but he can't be there all the time when Jeremy needs him. So thankfully there's a very skilled health director, Philippa Pictou, who knows of a Supreme Court of Nova Scotia decision that spells out very clearly what children in Jeremy's situation should get, which is respite services in the home until the caregiver recovers from their medical disability. The government of Canada said, no, we're not going to pay attention to that Supreme Court order. And they outlined instead 3 options for Maurina. They said, really, in an email, they say, conditions could deteriorate so badly in that home because Maurina, despite her best efforts, won't be able to provide your Jeremy's care, that we could intervene with child welfare and the government of Canada would pay for that, which to me is appalling. Child welfare is not to be used for those purposes. Then we have option B, which is let's place Jeremy in an institution. Well, Jeremy, his whole life has been at Pictou Landing Band Council. That's where he's most comfortable. Those are his people and his language. And when he's separated from family and unfamiliar situations, he engages in very difficult self-harming behavior. So there's no evidence that placing him in an institution would be better for him. And then option 3 is that this small First Nations community, although it receives no funding for this type of high special needs child, should pay for that service. And then if they are unable to continue, then we still have the child welfare institutional placement. Well, Maurina Beadle, knowing about Jordan's principle, says to herself, I do not want anything for Jeremy that is a child welfare placement or an institution. He deserves the same thing that any other child would get. So she takes the federal government, along with Pictou Landing Band Council join her, to court, to federal court. And they argue that this is a breach of the law. The government's failure to implement Jordan's principle is a breach of the law. So on June 11th, 2012, that case was argued in federal court in Halifax. And many of your people watching this video will remember June 11th is the anniversary of the Prime Minister's apology for residential schools. So it was particularly symbolic that in that courtroom, Maurina Beadle was trying to fight for Jordan's principle, not only for her son, but as she quickly says, for all other children in the country. Well, just a couple weeks ago, the federal court returned the decision, and they found that Canada's very narrow definition of Jordan's principle is unlawful. And they ordered the federal government to pay for Jeremy's care. And they also ordered that they pay for the Maurina's court costs and for Pictou Landing Band Council's court costs. And you know, that evening when I found out about the decision, I was on Facebook and I communicate with Jordan's sisters. And I wanted them to be the first to know about this wonderful decision. And it really boils their heart to see that now Jordan's principle is becoming something in law, something that the government can't just wiggle out with words, but something that actually has a real effect on the rights of children. And when we all step back from Jordan's principle and we think about it, what we're really talking about is ending racial discrimination against little kids. We're saying to the government that it's not okay to say, hold on, you don't get the service, or hold on, you've got to wait or jump 500 other hoops just because of who you are. That's what Jordan's principle wants to put an end to. And that's what Jordan's legacy is to all of us. And for all of your viewers, there's something every single one of us can do. You can go on to jordansprinciple.ca and sign up and support Jordan's Principle. Join the thousands of other First Nations citizens and non-Aboriginal allies and organizations and First Nations governments who say, we support Jordan's Principle. It takes under 2 minutes and it's completely free. So there's something each one of us can do. And then share Jordan's Principle in your families and communities and let everyone know that it exists. And no matter what government says, we have a federal court decision that says Jordan's principle is now more than just a motion, more than just a policy. It's now part of Canadian law. I think that many First Nations should take a very significant look at the Beadle case. We need to go back and talk to provincial governments and remind them of the true spirit of Jordan's principle. And that is that it applies to all government services and end those inequities. And if necessary, I mean, I hope it would not be necessary, but if the government is continuing to perpetrate this type of discrimination against children, then I think all of us, it's up to all of us to explore all peaceful and respectful options to make that end. And that includes going to human rights tribunals, it includes charter challenges and the like, because no child should be left behind because of their race. We owe it to the kids and we owe it to the ancestors.